we're delighted today to have Professor Sarooj Dabab from the University of Toronto. He's a philosopher, also trained in pharmacy, and he works in both moral philosophy, political theory, also bioethics, and a whole number of areas of philosophy. He's also a scholar in exile because his progressive views on Islam and democracy, I guess, are thought subversive to the Iranian government. And so we're fortunate to have him here today, in part because he can't be in Iran, and so he happens to be, well, in the United States via Toronto. Today, as you saw on the flyer, the title of his talk is Islamic Hijab, and so please welcome with me Professor Dabab.
Okay, first of all, let me thank Professor Lori Schreck and Philosophy Department and University of Florida for kind invitation. I had a talk actually on Wednesday on Islamic ethics and secular ethics. And today I'm going to talk about, as you can see, the Islamic Hijab from both the jurisprudential aspect and the ethical and philosophical aspect. Okay, my talk has got two parts. The first part has got a reviewing what has talked about on this area in the contemporary contemporary Muslim scholars and the idea of hijab, and then try to elaborate the issue from the ethical and philosophical perspective. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is the moral permissibility, of unwavering, both from the jurisprudential and ethical perspectives, is going to be discussed today in this talk. The views of the Islamic jurists and the Quran's commentators who do believe that unwavering is permissible, unlike the dominant reading amongst jurists and commentators, or Quran commentators. Moreover, I will examine the idea of hijab in terms of the ethics of prima facie duties, the ethical theory of the British philosopher David Ross, as discussed in The Right and the Good and Foundations of Ethics. This is the two parts of my talk, as I mentioned. Okay. In order to talk about the moral relevance of the hijab and the way in which it is discussed in the works of contemporary Muslim thinkers, let us talk about the relationship between religion and morality in general in the first place. The relationship between religion and morality in the Abrahamic religion is a much discussed subject in moral philosophy and philosophy of religion. Some theorists do believe that morality is primarily based on religion. Others insist that morality is not primarily based on religion. In order to arrive at a clearer account and understanding of the relationship between religion and morality, let us apply Descartes' principle, i.e. dividing a difficulty into parts to resolve it. Inductive reasoning allows us to speak of a semantic relationship, an ontological relationship, and epistemological relationship between religion and morality. To say that morality is semantically based on religion means that moral notions such as fairness, unfairness, good, bad, out, not, etc. can only be understood in the light of scripture. The scripture in Abrahamic religion, such as Quran, Bible, and Old Testament. This means that moral notions have no independent and inherent definitions. In the opposite camp, theorists who hold that morality is not semantically based on religion are of the view that moral notions can have meanings without reference to scripture. Okay. The theorists who maintain that morality is ontologically based on religion believe that the materialization and delineation of moral values in the world around us hangs on the will of God. If God wills it, moral values such as good, bad, etc. come into being. Then, attributing goodness to honesty and badness to dishonesty, for instance, will be keeping will be in keeping with the will of God, and we can seek them in the world around us. In the Islamic tradition, the Ash'arites believe in this sense that morality was ontologically based on religion and could not exist independently of God's will. If God willed that something was good, it was good. And if God willed that something was bad, it was bad. It was the attachment of God's will to something that gave it moral substance. And without God's will, moral values would not exist in the world. As a result of which we could be unable to formulate wrong judgments. Now, in the opposite camp, the Mu'tazilite, let me just very briefly and quickly say that Ash'arite and Mu'tazilite, there are two main theological schools in the Muslim world. The dominant reading of the scripture, theologically speaking, belongs to the Ash'arite, and the Mu'tazilite are marginalized. But nowadays, there is a movement which has happened since a few decades ago. They try to revive the Mu'tazilite school, and they are called Neo-Mu'tazilite. Anyway, in the opposite camp, the Mu'tazilites were of the view that morality was not ontologically based on religion. They believed that moral notions were intrinsically and rationally good or bad, and that it was possible to make judgments about their existence in the world and to delineate them independently of scripture and based on rational discoveries and teachings. Now, the epistemological relationship between morality and religion, jurisprudence. By jurisprudence, I mean fiqh, which is called Sharia as well in the Islamic literature. The epistemological relationship between morality and religion reveals how can arrive at moral knowledge. Theorists who believe that morality is epistemologically based on religion deny the epistemological validity of moral claims that have been derived without recourse to and reliance on the scripture. Take, for example, the moral proposition, it is a duty to keep a promise. Anyone who believes that morality is epistemologically based on religion will only accept this moral proposition if it is justified on the basis of religious teachings. In other words, rational moral precepts and judgments which have been derived from reason alone have no inherent validity and do not have convey in information. That's the epistemological relationship between religion and morality, as we can see. In the opposite camp, those who hold that morality is not epistemologically based on religion, such as the Western philosophers, for instance, Jeremy Bentham, Immanuel Kant, Richard Moore, David Ross, Richard Herron, etc., whose position can be dubbed secular morality, view rational moral precepts favorably and organize their conception of morality around it. These theorists are of the view that the epistemological validity of a moral claim, such as it is duty to keep your promise, is attained using epistemological resources, such as practical reason, rational evidence, intuition, and etc. Okay, I'm going to finish this part by saying that what I'm going to utilize in our discussion today is a version which is called weak divine command theory. I do believe in this version of divine command theory, according to which, ontologically speaking and semantically speaking, morality is independent of the scripture. Okay? Ontologically speaking and semantically speaking. Semantic deals with the meaning of ethical words and notions, as I mentioned. And ontologically deals with the way in which, for instance, moral values and moral principles are independently of us in the world, and so on and so forth. So, as far as moral semantics and moral ontology are concerned, weak divine command theories do believe that these notions are independently of the scripture. But when we come to the epistemology, they do believe in a kind of mutual relationship between our commonsensical moral intuitions on the one hand and the God's will or God's command on the other hand. They call this position as a kind of weak divine command theory. In a way, morality is dependent on the scripture, but not entirely. as I mentioned, semantically and ontologically speaking, morality is going to be independent of the scripture and religion, but when we come to epistemology and arriving at justified and plausible moral judgments, we have to think about and take into account both our commonsensical moral intuitions on the one hand, and the God's will or God's command, which is appeared in the scripture, on the other hand. That is called weak divine command theory as far as I can see. In comparison with strong divine command theory as Ash'arites, which I introduced at the beginning, they do believe. For instance, some great mystics in the Islamic tradition like Rumi or Abu al-Hasan Ash'ari and others, they do believe in Ash'ari, or they do believe in Ash'ari and a strong version of divine command theory. But the weak version of divine command theory, as I mentioned, is based on the scripture just as far as epistemology is concerned and looking for a kind of mutual relationship between our commonsensical moral intuitions on the one hand and the scripture and the God's will or command, which is scripture, which is revealed in the scripture. Okay, in order to arrive at plausible judgments in the realm of jurisprudence or fiqh, I prefer to utilize reflective equilibrium in the Rawlsian sense, methodologically speaking. If you have got any questions in order to more elaborate these notions, I can talk about it in Q&A because lots of things to be discussed right away. But I think if you are aware of John Rawls' work, this idea is very well known. Reflective equilibrium is a kind of mutual relationships between different and scattered intuitions which we have got in different realms of knowledge. So we refer to it as reflective equilibrium methodologically speaking. Moreover, it would be better to use modest coherentism, foundationalism, epistemologically speaking, as Robert Audi categorized it. It is just as far as when fiqh and morality come into conflict, I'm going to use these two methods in order to arrive at the plausible moral judgments when commonsensical moral intuitions and the jurisprudence and the fiqh, they come into conflict. I mean, if you have got any question on that, we can talk about it in Q&A, and I'm going to elaborate based upon your question. Okay, now, based upon this theoretical framework which I presented, let us talk about the idea of hijab in detail and to see what can be said and talked about in this regard as far as jurisprudence and morality is concerned based upon weak divine command theory, as I mentioned. This is the theoretical apparatus, let's say. Weak divine command theory. If you don't buy weak divine command theory, you couldn't follow up my discussion today. If, for instance, you do believe in a strong version of divine command theory, definitely you won't buy my position. But if you do buy weak divine command theory, you could follow up and you could see where I'm coming from and to what extent I'm going to put forward an argument in favor of the permissibility of unveiling, as I mentioned at the beginning. Okay, there have been numerous debates on women's hijab over centuries by religious figures and scholars. In Shiite tradition, Ahmad Qabil is a cleric, died recently, and Mohsen Khadiver, two of Grand Ayatollah Muntazir's outstanding pupils, who were conferred the name of Mujtahid by him. You know Mujtahid, the ulama, the one who is entitled to issue fatwa. This is Mujtahid. In the Islamic seminaries, when you call somebody as Mujtahid, it means that he's entitled to issue a fatwa, religious fatwa, issue a religious fatwa. Ahmad Qabil and Mohsen Khadiver, two of Grand Ayatollah's Muntaziri, who died and passed away 3 years ago, outstanding pupils who were conferred the name of Mujtahid by him, unlike the dominant reading, believe that no evidence can be extracted from the verses of the Quran in regards to firm laws of covering the head and neck by women. According to Qabil, Ahmad Qabil, wearing the hijab primarily was the sign of identity for free women at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. That was Qabil jurisprudentially puts it, that in the first place, wearing the hijab was the sign of identity. It wasn't something related to ethical and the idea of lust and so on and so forth, unlike the dominant reading. So that is the point which Qabil puts it in some of his articles which published, I think, 5-6 years ago in Shiite circle and Shiite seminaries. So the main argument from Qabul's point of view is that, as I mentioned, hijab was the sign of identity for free women, unlike slavery women. That was a distinction and dichotomy between free women and slavery women. زنان حره and زنان غیر حره and غیر حره. The one who were free, the one who were slave. So that was the sign of identity according to Ahmad Qabul. Abdul Ali Bazargan and Ahmad Turkashvan, contemporary commentators of the Quran, again in the Shiite circle. They have published extensively on the Quran and the way in which they interpret Quran. States that hijab in the Quran does not necessarily mean covering the head, hair, and neck, but it simply denotes covering those body members that make sexually stimulate men. It follows from this that the dominant fatwas with regard to hijab have to be considered jurisprudentially speaking, according to these scholars. So according to these scholars, the fatwas which have been issued so far on the very idea of hijab have to be considered by taking into account the point that the idea of hijab primarily, as I mentioned, was the sign of identity for free women. That was fatwas, that was Ahmad Qabul's fatwa, but Abdul Ali Bazargan, as a commentator of Quran, he said that not necessarily, though the sexually stimulate the body members that may sexually stimulate men sounds crucial, but not necessarily it should be appear and should be categorized in wearing the hijab, covering the neck and hair. Okay, this is amongst the scholars who in Shiite circle so far have discussed the idea of hijab from the jurisprudential and hermeneutical aspect. Because Bazargan and Turkashvan, as I mentioned, they tried to read the Quran from the hermeneutical point of view in such a way. And Qabul, as a mujtahid, issued a fatwa, as I mentioned, and Kadiwar as a mujtahid, they issued a fatwa unlike the dominant reading. Again, I'm pretty sure that this is unlike this dominant reading even nowadays in Shiite circles and Sunni circles. In Qom and Najaf, for instance, or in Azhar in Egypt and others, doesn't matter as it. Okay, what about Sunni tradition? In Sunni tradition, as far as I know, and read some stuff by Muslim contemporary thinkers, there are some Muslim scholars like Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, who passed away 2 years ago, Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri, Ahmad Subhi Mansour, and Muhammad Said Ashmawi. They are all Muslim reformists nowadays. Abu Zayd passed away 2 years ago, likewise Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri. However, Ahmad Subhi Mansour and Muhammad Said Ashmawi, they are still alive. They do believe more or less the same as Ahmad Qabul, as I mentioned. They are not faqih, they are not mujtahid, the same as Qabul and Kadiwar. They are the commentators of the Quran, or they are the ones who are familiar with Turas, with the tradition, Quranic tradition, or Sunnat Qurani. They are familiar with the Quranic tradition. So according to them, they do believe that wearing the hijab is not necessary nowadays, jurisprudentially speaking, necessary. Why? According to them, covering hijab and neck primarily was the sign of identity again, at the time of Prophet Muhammad. So there are two crucial and famous verses in Quran, which is called an ayah khimar and ayah hijab and jalabi. They interpret the text in such a way, both, Nasr Hamid Abu Zayd, Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri, and Ahmad Subhi Mansour, as well as Ahmad Turkashvan in Shiite circle, they interpret the text in such a way that it doesn't mean that women have to cover their face, including hair and neck and their head. It doesn't mean that. Because according to them, khimar or jilbab, doesn't mean at that time that they have to do that. It's a matter of identity, and apart from that, it doesn't have to be regarded in such a way that all hairs and neck have to be covered. Semantically speaking, and the words which they were meant on that time. That's the way, for instance, Korkashman and Nas Hamad Abuzay tried to talk about the text hermeneutically speaking, as I mentioned, and in Shiite tradition, Qabil and Kadibar issued a fatwa in this regard. To my knowledge, and I'll publish some papers on that in Persian, an English version is going to come out recently. To my knowledge, as far as I know, could be I'm mistaken, I couldn't find any fatwas by Sunni mujtahid on the permissibility of unveiling. The ones which I have got so far, as I referred to in this talk, they are Muslim intellectuals, Muslim reformists so far, in Sunni tradition. I mean, like Abu Zayd Abid al-Jabari and Ahmad Subhi Mansur, who said something similar. But in Shiite circle, as I mentioned, at least there are two clerics, two mujtahid, who issued a fatwa in this regard, at least Ahmad Qabil and Mohsen Kadibar, as I mentioned. And you could find, the references in my paper in Persian and hopefully in the near future in English, the ones where the fatwas are issued, and you could find them. Anyway, so far, I think so good with regard to the issue which has been discussed both jurisprudentially speaking and hermeneutically speaking in Shiite seminaries and Sunni seminaries in Shiite circle and Sunni circle. Okay, it is also to be mentioned that from ethical perspective and according to the majority of ethicists, it is quite believed that the mandatory hijab is against the freedom of choice and hence morally wrong and impermissible. In Shiite tradition again, Muhammad Ayazi, again another Ayatollah Muqtadir's outstanding pupil, does believe that compulsory hijab, unlike optional hijab, is wrong, jurisprudentially speaking. Ayazi do believe in optional hijab, and according to him, it is necessary, jurisprudentially speaking, unlike Qabil and Kadibar. But he strongly and explicitly said that mandatory hijab is unethical and even jurisprudentially speaking, it is wrong. As you're well aware, nowadays in Iran, it is practiced, mandatory hijab. And so, as he lives in Iran, said that mandatory hijab is unethical and even jurisprudentially speaking, it is implausible. Okay, now let us talk about the idea of hijab from the philosophical perspective and the way I'm going to categorize the issue. So far we have seen the jurisprudential and hermeneutical aspect of the hijab as we've seen. Now, what about the philosophical aspect of the hijab if we want to categorize such an issue? This issue has to be talked about, as you know, normative ethics. Normative ethics deals with what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. For instance, if or whether or not telling the truth is right, or harming others is right or wrong, that's the issue which is talked about in normative ethics, rather than the more abstract and philosophical level, which sounds metaphysical, epistemological, and semantic, which I said at the beginning. That goes to meta-ethics. But when we come to normative ethics, it sounds more practical and tangible and deal with what we deal with in our everyday life. So there are at least different ethical theory in the realm of normative ethics, known as deontologism, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics, at least. These are three main majors, let's say, in the realm of normative ethics. Okay, what I'm going to do in the second part of my talk is to talk about the idea of hijab in the light of the ethics of prima facie duties. This is another ethical school in the realm of normative ethics. As I mentioned, there are these three different versions of normative ethical theory, and the ethics of prima facie duty is a version of deontologism, as you can see. It's a version of deontologism, which I'm going to talk about it and categorize the idea of hijab. Now, let us talk about the ethics of prima facie duties very quickly and see what about the moral relevance of hijab in this regard. Okay, The doctrine of an ethics of prima facie duties is presented by David Ross in 1930 and 1939 to clarify the problem of moral conflict. According to Ross, the problem of moral conflict is best understood in terms of conflict between competing moral considerations. Moral conflict arises when the situation we are dealing with possesses more than one morally relevant non-moral property, which pull in opposite directions. This gives us conflicting prima facie duties, according to Ross. In order to decide what our actual duty is what ought to be done. What is required to do this or that. That is actual duty in the Rossian story. In order to decide what our actual duty is, we have to find out which relevant non-moral property is more important from the moral point of view. But says Ross, we do not have a basic general principle to say in advance which prima facie duty is overriding, because the weight or importance or magnitude of the relevant non-moral features of the situation may vary from case to case, though its weightance, i.e. the way in which it contributes to the moral evaluation of different cases, is invariant. For instance, you have got the prima facie duty of fidelity, and you have got the prima facie of gratitude, but the weight can vary from context to context. Though, as we can see in a minute, the list of prima facie duties for Ross is crucial, but the weight of each prima facie duty in each ethical context can vary from case to case, And what is required and crucial and has to be taken into account is the way in which we arrive at actual duty. The actual duty which is action guiding, and a person, the subject, has to act in accordance with the actual duty. Okay, I'll give you an example to make it more clear in a minute. On Ross's view, there are several basic non-moral properties that are morally relevant, and these cannot be reduced to one or more basic properties. Hence, these properties are not just at first sight epistemically, but real general types of duty. Morally relevant non-moral properties are not contextual. As I mentioned, their deontic weightance and the way in which they contribute to the moral evaluation of different cases is constant, but their effect and power or weight, you can see, may vary from case to case. Now, let us talk about four metaphysical claims in the Rossian ethical story, and then apply it on the case of hijab, or the moral relevance of hijab, as I mentioned. There are four metaphysical claims which can be found out in the Rossian ethical story. One, there are several prima facie duties which are general. These are duties to respond to morally relevant features that contribute to the moral evaluation of concrete ethical situation in a regular way. Two, the list of prima facie duties is open-ended. There is no such a thing as a finite list of prima facie duties. However, it is open-ended and can be added, or can be shorter or longer. It depends. Three, these prima facie duties are underived and fundamental in the sense that they cannot be reduced to more basic duties. Okay? This is the third metaphysical claim. And the fourth, which is crucial, there is no such a thing as a lexical order and hierarchy for these prima facie duties. They can combine together and contribute to the moral evaluation of different cases in different ways. Let me give you an example. Suppose that you're invited to a ceremony, and there are lots of guys who are going to be around just to meet you in that ceremony. Okay? So, the prima facie duty fidelity requires you to attend the meeting, because you already promised to attend the meeting tonight, for instance. Okay? However, when you are planning to attend the meeting just 1 or 2 hours before, you got or found out that your mother, having had a car accident, unfortunately, she has been hospitalized. And nobody could join her in the hospital. So you are in a conflicting situation in the Rossian sense. On the one hand, the prima facie duty fidelity requires you to join the meeting. And on the other hand, the prima facie duty of gratitude requires you to join your mother because what she has done so far for you. So they're coming to conflict. And according to the Russian view, there is no lexical order between different prima facie duties. The weight of each prima facie duty can vary from context to context. It's not something which is patternable and can be talked about in advance. It's entirely context dependent. This is the way in which Ross tries to make a distinction between moral value and moral weight. The list of prima facie duties have constant moral value, but their moral weight can vary from case to case. In the case which I mentioned, suppose that if, as I mentioned at the beginning, nobody could join your mother, so it seems that, intuitively speaking, that the weight of the prima facie duty of gratitude is more, and you have to cancel the ceremony and join your mother, intuitively speaking. But suppose, as a thought experiment, in other situations in which, for instance, your sister or your brother, they could join your mother, and the meeting is very crucial for you and for the others who work for you anyway. So in this situation, again, prima facie duty gratitude and prima facie duty fidelity, they come into conflict. But the point is that here the weight of prima facie duty of fidelity is more, so you have to cancel, you have to join the meeting and cancel, you have to join your mother, sorry, you have to join the meeting and, for instance, your sister, you're going to join your mother. Anyway, so based upon that, according to the epistemological claim, in order to arrive at a justified moral judgment or an actual duty in a concrete ethical situation, we have to use our moral intuitions. By intuition, Ross refers to a source of knowledge which is perceptual and non-inferential. As there is no lexical order, as I mentioned, there is no lexical order between different prima facie duties, we cannot arrive at justified moral judgments through rules governing prima facie duties and their combinations. Okay, Ross does not believe that we can arrive at moral judgments by the mediation of a moral rule, as I mentioned, because it is entirely context dependent. There is no such a thing as a theoretical procedure for delivering moral judgments. Rather, we pick up the ultimate outcome of the combination of morally relevant features directly by looking at the case in more details in order to arrive at a moral judgment. Moral intuitions do this job in the Rossian story. Now, here is the list of prima facie duties in the Rossian story: fidelity, gratitude, non-maleficence, justice, self-improvement, reparation, and beneficence. As I mentioned, the list is open-ended, it's incomplete. But Ross tries to talk about the list of prima facie duties in The Right and the Good, and puts the primary list in such a way. You could see that these prima facie duties are derived and basic. But they are, according to Ross, there are some derived prima facie duties as well. For instance, as you can see, according to the list, there is no such thing as a true spelling of these. Okay? Because we have got gratitude, fidelity, non-maleficence, justice, improvement, and so on and so forth. There is no prima facie duty as true spelling. So according to Ross, true spelling is a derived prima facie duty. And by combining fidelity and non-maleficence, according to Ross, we could arrive at a derived prima facie duty, which is called true spelling. Okay? So in such a way, Ross tries to give a comprehensive account of our commonsensical moral intuitions, in which he could make room for different prima facie duties, both the underived ones and the derived ones. The ones which are in the list in the first place, which are called the underived prima facie duties, and the one which could be gleaned from the combination of 2 or 3 prima facie duties. I mentioned just true spelling as one of them. Okay, now, what about the moral relevance of wearing the hijab? If we want to utilize this theoretical apparatus and see what can be said in this regard. In order to answer this question, let us utilize Bernard Williams' distinction between peak moral concepts and free moral concepts very briefly. As we well aware, in the realm of, in ordinary life, let's say, we have We are doing lots of things. For instance, running, eating, fighting, and so on and so forth. Okay? Let us categorize and regard these actions as natural actions. As natural actions. You could say, for instance, running, what is it all about? Eating, lying, fighting, reading, writing, they are natural things. Okay? They are natural phenomena which we are dealing with in our everyday life. Bernard Williams wants to say that as far as we stick to the natural phenomena, as far as we cannot say anything which is morally relevant. In order to talk about something which is morally relevant, we have to categorize them under moral categories and moral concepts. For instance, if I am somebody, for instance, is hitting is a small brother. Hitting a small brother is a natural phenomenon, like this. Something like this. This is natural phenomenon. It doesn't have any moral relevance according to Bernard Williams, insofar as we're just talking about something which is natural. So when I'm hitting my small brother, that's a natural phenomenon. It doesn't have any moral relevance. However, if I categorize it under the concept causing pain, or some, according to the Bernard Williams thick moral concept, that has got moral relevance. As long as just I'm talking about hitting as running, as sleeping, as lying, and what, so on and so forth, it doesn't have any moral relevance. According to Bernard Williams, thick moral concepts consist of the concept which has got moral relevance, and we have to utilize them in order to issue a moral judgment. For instance, beneficence, fidelity, non-maleficence, they are thick moral concepts according to Bernard Williams. And on the other hand, badness, rightness, wrongness, and duty, they are thin moral concepts in the Williams sense. Now, the moral relevance which is crucial for us is the concept modesty and chastity. Modesty and chastity. According to Bernard Williams, or if you want to categorize it and apply it in the realm of hijab, modesty and chastity, as far as I can see, is a thick moral concept. We can regard it as a derived prima facie duty. If you remember the distinction between derived and underived prima facie duties in the Rossian account, we can regard it as a derived prima facie duty in the Rossian framework. The prima facie duty, which consists of fidelity, non-maleficence, and self-improvement. In such a way, as far as I can see, we can talk about the derived prima facie duty, chastity, or modesty, okay, as a thick moral concept. So let me just repeat. What I'm going to do now is that to see the moral relevance of wearing the hijab. And the most relevant thick moral concept, which is similar, which is associated with wearing the hijab, is modesty or chastity. And modesty or chastity in the Rossian story is a derived prima facie duty. You could talk about it based upon fidelity, non-maleficence, and self-improvement. In a way, by being chaste, you are doing your fidelity and non-maleficence and self-improvement. It follows from this that being chaste is a prima facie duty, which makes our actual duty other things being equal. So this is so far, I have tried to show the moral relevance of wearing the hijab. And as far as its moral relevance is concerned, by the aid of the ethics of prima facie duties in the Rossian sense. Now, I am inclined to conclude that, at this part, that not bearing head, hair and neck does not reject the prima facie duty, modesty and chastity for women nowadays, intuitively speaking. So, what I'm trying to show is that so far, if we want to talk about wearing the hijab, because wearing the hijab, again, be careful, wearing the hijab is a kind of natural phenomenon. As I've said, if I'm talking about hitting a small brother or whatever, or running and so on and so forth, they are natural phenomena. We can talk about their moral relevance whenever we categorize them under thick moral concepts. As I mentioned, hitting somebody else, when you categorize it under the thick concept harming others and so on and so forth, it has got its own moral relevance. So when we are talking about the wearing the hijab. Be careful, we are talking about it in a philosophical sense, not in a jurisprudential or analytical sense. I talked about this part in advance. Now I'm talking about purely from the philosophical aspect. When we are talking about the natural behavior, the natural action, which is wearing the hijab, by hijab I mean especially here wearing the neck and hair, okay? Wearing the hijab is which is a natural phenomenon, which is a natural action, can be categorized under the concept of chastity or modesty, if we are talking about this moral relevance, okay? Like other natural phenomenal behavior, as I mentioned. Now, if we, by the distinction between thick and thin moral properties, as is introduced by Bernard Williams, in order to shed light and categorize the moral relevance of our natural behavior, it seems to me that wearing the hijab is categorized under the concept of chastity or modesty. Now, nowadays, since, I don't know, 19th century onwards or so, or even only in most parts of the world, I mean in North America, Latin America, I mean, for instance, European countries and Eastern countries like Japan, North Korea, South Korea, China, Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. In most parts of the world, be careful, not wearing hair and neck, or unveiling, let's say, if I want to utilize the correct phrase, is not categorized as something which is in contradiction or is undermining the whole idea of chastity or modesty. If you want to talk about the moral relevance of wearing the hijab, you have to show its connection between modesty and chastity, intuitively speaking. Okay? So what I'm going to say is that if in the Russian story we regard chastity and modesty as a prima facie duty, which can be our actual duty and actual action guiding if other things are being equal, I'm going to say that not wearing the hair and neck does not reject the prima facie duty, modesty and chastity for women nowadays, intuitively speaking. In a way, today, modesty and chastity is not just limited to wearing the hijab. It depends on a kind of, it is based upon your lifestyle in a way. It depends on your behavior with others. It's not just wearing the hair or neck and so on and so forth. Why? Because in principle, it could be the case that even you are wearing the hijab, in principle, but the way in which you behave others is not a chaste behavior. So if this is the case, we could say that there is no necessary connection between being chaste and wearing the hijab. You see, there is no necessary connection because at the thought experiment, as I mentioned, it could be the case that you are wearing the hijab, but the way in which you're behaving, for instance, a man is not, the behavior is a chaste behavior. It could be the case. So if this is the case, which we can accept it intuitively, it follows from this that there is no necessary connection between wearing the hijab and being chaste, or being being chaste. So if this is the case, what I'm going to say is that intuitively speaking, there is no connection or necessary connection, let's say, between modesty and chastity on the one hand and wearing the hijab. For sure, there could be the case that women wear the hijab and behavior, and you can categorize her behavior as a chaste. For sure, that could be the case. What I'm talking about, this aspect of the issue, that as it could be the case in principle, that you wear the hijab, but you don't care about the modesty or chastity, and somebody else could categorize your behavior as not chaste. So that's the connection which I'll focus on. And it seems that for women today, intuitively speaking, if somebody not wearing the hijab, it cannot be the rejection of modesty and chastity. It follows from this that not wearing the hijab and unveiling is not wrong and implausible, morally speaking. If the argument which is presented is sound and valid, you could say that not wearing the hijab and unveiling is not wrong and implausible, morally speaking. Why? Because it's not in the denial of chastity or modesty, which is the moral relevance which is taken into account and has to be considered. Moreover, it doesn't follow from this that wearing the hijab is an ethical category. The other way. There are a lot of cases in which wearing the hijab would be permissible and ethical. However, if wearing the hijab is overridden by another prima facie duty, in an ethical context, say non-maleficence for instance, it would be wrong to wear the hijab according to the Russian story. So, what I'm going to say is that, as we have seen so far, modesty or chastity is a prima facie duty, okay? As I argued for. What I'm going to say is that not unveiling is not the denial of the prima facie duty of modesty or chastity, the derived prima facie duty of modesty or chastity. Apart from that, what I'm going to say is that because it could be a case in which even a prima facie duty of modesty is overridden by another prima facie duty, there are some cases in which, for instance, as a thought experiment, it could be the case that not wearing the hijab, let's say, the prima facie duty of modesty and chastity could be overridden by another prima facie duty, for instance, say non-maleficence. So if this is the case, wearing the hijab could be overridden by another prima facie duty in an ethical context, say non-maleficence for instance. It would be wrong to wear the hijab in such a situation according to the Russian story. Last but not least, having seen the arguments which are presented in this talk, I am going to conclude that wearing the hijab is not necessary, both jurisprudentially and morally speaking. Why jurisprudentially? As we have seen, there is a possible scenario interpretation of the text which tried to shed light on the issue that wearing the hijab was a matter of, or a sign of identity, as I mentioned at the beginning and during the life of Prophet Muhammad. And so there are some Muslim scholars and some mujtahids who say that, jurisprudentially speaking, wearing the hijab is not necessary, as I referred to them. And the second is that, intuitively speaking, we could say that nowadays, unveiling the hijab is not the denial of the prima facie duty of chastity or modesty, as we have seen, which is the moral relevance of wearing the hijab, the moral relevance of a natural phenomenon like wearing the hijab. Now, I'm inclined to conclude that by introducing and by accepting the weak divine common theory, which I mentioned at the beginning, if you remember, on the one hand, we have got the reading of the text and scripture, according to which, as I mentioned, wearing the hijab is not necessary on the one hand. On the other hand, we have got a consensus, let's say, consensus and a lot of commonsensical moral intuitions, according to which unveiling and not wearing the hijab or not covering head and neck and head nowadays is not going to be the rejection of the prima facie duty of chastity or modesty, as I mentioned. So, if we want to go ahead according to the weak version of divine common theory, in order to arrive at plausible and justified moral judgments or normative judgments, having considered these two together, on the one side, the possible scenario of talking about or regarding hijab as a matter, as a sign of identity, rather than God's command necessarily. And on the other hand, as I mentioned, there is a consensus nowadays that not wearing the hijab is unethical and is not the denial of modesty or chastity. So I'm inclined to conclude that by accepting divine common theory, even we could say that nowadays not wearing the hijab wouldn't be unethical, and it wouldn't be unethical jurisprudentially and morally. Or let me put it this way: it's not necessary, both jurisprudentially and morally speaking. Okay, I know that lots of things have been discussed in this talk. Thanks for your patience, but we have got plenty of time to the Q&A section. If there is any question or something needs to be cashed out and elaborated, I'm looking forward to hear and have a good discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.